Hello and welcome to the weekly wind-up from Kirklees Local Television. My name's Kyle Warwick and joining me this week are Grainne McMahon, the Senior Lecturer in Criminology from Huddersfield University, and Tom Ashworth, who is here to talk to us about his book on World War I. First up on this week's show, we discuss the increased crime rate among young people in the region. According to Ministry of Justice figures, the period between April 2013 and March 2014 saw youth crime increase by 66% on the same period in the previous 12 months. This was the biggest increase in youth crime for any local authority in England and Wales. Grainne, I'll come to you first. In your opinion, what can such steep rises in youth offending be attributed to?
Okay, I think the first thing that we need to be careful about when we're talking about youth crime and statistics, we need to be aware that statistics, particularly official statistics around crime, are not always accurate. And they're compiled in several different ways and are mostly based around the ways in which the police record and process crime. There's a lot of crime which does not make it into police statistics. And further, there's a lot of often manipulation around the ways that police crime was recorded, etc., etc. So I wouldn't be too hasty to conclude that there has been a steep rise in youth crime. Moreover, the statistics indicate that over the last 5 years, there's actually been a sharp drop in youth crime in the Kirklees area. However, if I was to answer the question about how we can explain youth crime, I think in the Kirklees area and in North England in particular, we need to consider that there are severe pockets of deprivation in Kirklees and the surrounding area, and that is definitely linked to crime in whatever form. There have also been a huge raft of, there's also been a huge raft of changes to the youth justice system since the coalition government got into power in 2010, and they have changed the way that the criminal justice system and the youth justice system work. It's a very target-driven culture, for example, which means that police forces may be more tempted to target minor crimes because they're easier to process, they're easier to meet their targets, etc., which means that it might indicate, yes, that there's been a steep rise in youth crime when that's not actually the case. But I think that it's definitely around deprivation. I think that our educational policies for young people need to be examined if we're to do anything about youth crime. I think that we do have emerging and growing problems with substances and substance misuse that are certainly linked to youth crime. But we need to be very careful with young people. We need to be very careful with the way our system treats young people. We need to treat them as children rather than adults, which has historically been the case.
Do you feel then maybe that the reporting of increases in youth crime can sometimes contribute to young people becoming more involved in youth crime?
I'm not sure that the increase in reporting of youth crime to the police necessarily means that young people are more likely to become involved. But I think that there is often a problematic targeting of certain groups of young people for what we have started calling, well, for the last 15 years, we've been calling this antisocial behaviour, even though we're not really sure what antisocial behaviour is, and it means different things to different people. There are certain groups who are targeted for accusations of antisocial behaviour, and that's more likely to be the case than for other groups. There are more likely, young people of colour, for example, are more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, and there's certainly some impact then on how they engage with the youth justice system. But I think that crime statistics are most responsible for increasing a fear of crime unnecessarily. And the media are very, very quick and hasty to report an increase in crime depending on what statistics they're looking at. And that certainly leads to a fear of crime and, importantly, a mistrust of certain groups, which is quite worrying.
So do you feel then that the media has played a role in the sort of increase of fear in young people?
Absolutely, and we have a lot of research evidence which suggests that yes, the mainstream media in particular has contributed to the demonisation of certain pockets of the youth population, not least because of this idea of antisocial behaviour in certain groups which are more likely to commit antisocial behaviour. And this conflation of antisocial behaviour and youth crime, because they're not the same thing. Antisocial behaviours are not criminal activities. But the media was they were very enthusiastic about Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister's ideas about youth crime and his tackling of antisocial behaviour and youth crime. For better or for worse, that's probably a discussion for another time. And it's certainly fed into this idea that there are pockets of the youth population about which we should be very fearful, but also very afraid of.
Tom, how do you feel about that?
Oh, I think if we simply look at the headlines and the ball statistics, they're quite shocking, but I certainly agree that statistics only play a part of the whole question. I gather, for instance, that there's the impression of crime. People of my age, pensioners, have a much greater impression of crime and feel that they are one of the few groups or one of the groups that are most at threat of crime. But in actual fact, I suspect that it's young men on a Saturday night and a Friday, Saturday night in the city centre who are at far greater risk than crime than we are. So yes, certainly shocking, but it's worth some calm deliberation behind there.
Absolutely, I think we can all agree with that. Grainne, to what extent do you feel that austerity measures have played a part in the report of rising crime?
The main impact of austerity measures on the criminal justice system in general has been this move towards privatisation. Now, that has taken place mostly in the adult justice sector. It's taken place to a lesser extent in the youth justice sector. The youth justice sector is not driven by the same sort of privatisation culture. But what it has meant across the board is that services for young people within the youth justice system are fewer. So the extent to which young people are rehabilitated is much lesser than it used to be. The extent to which restorative justice is a primary measure used in youth justice is much lesser than it used to be. And that's really unfortunate, because most of our research evidence about what works in reducing offending behaviour points to the idea of rehabilitative work and restorative justice work. But instead, from the new Labour government and right through the coalition, we have been sending more and more young people to custody. And that's as a result of austerity and also a very populist system that's built on various ideologies around how to deal with offending. In terms of young people's lives in general, the amount of services for young people have been cut. So there's much less for young people to do. There are much fewer services for young people in need. And indeed, I read a report just yesterday from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which has revealed that austerity measures have hit the worst, or the most deprived areas in England and Wales the most. So we could argue that there are pockets of Kirklees which unfortunately fall into that category. So the services, the amenities, the help for young people within those areas is lower than it's been in many, many years. And we know that young people who offend are more likely to come from difficult backgrounds, not all of them, but certainly some of them, and that has been exacerbated because of austerity measures.
So do you feel then that a preventative approach is more likely to work than an approach where we condemn people who have committed crimes?
Absolutely. And again, research evidence almost ironically says that the best way to stop a young person developing a criminal career is to not arrest them to begin with. Because once a young person becomes part of a criminal justice system, they become labelled as an offender. They might lose their school place. They might spend a period of time in custody. They are part of a system that is very, very difficult to leave. Whereas if we try to prevent problematic behaviours to begin with at an earlier age, or we use some sort of restorative work, rehabilitative work at the onset of offending, it has much, much higher success rates. And we know particularly that sending young people to custody is very, very detrimental to them. It's detrimental to their life course because of interruptions to their education, to their family life, etc. But it's also very detrimental to them as individuals because the custodial system is pretty harrowing. So I would be very much in favour, and I think most academics and people who work with young people would be very in favour of much earlier interventions that are much more person-centred and community-centred.
That's great. Thank you both for that. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this topic. If you would like any input on anything you hear on today's show, you can do so by the usual means. Email info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, and you can find us on Twitter, search @TheWeeklyWindup. After the break, we're going to be discussing the World War I book from Tom Ashworth.
However large or small your business, attracting new customers requires dedication and a lot of patience. Just like fishing, but you also need the right gear. Rods,
reels, lines, hooks, sinkers, lures,
tackle box, tackle bag, net, bait, gas gloves, clothes, and pocket knife roach.
or you could simply advertise with KLTV. Online, grow your business and your clientele. KLTV, your vision made reality. Should have gone to KLTV.
And welcome back. Joining me in this half are Tom Ashworth and Dave Hodgson. Dave's a Weekly Wind-Up resident who you will have more than likely seen before. Last year saw the centenary of the First World War. The First World War lasted from 1914 to 1918 and saw many brave souls from around the world risk and in many cases lay down their lives. As with the whole of the country, many men from the Kirklees region went away to fight for king and country. And a new book from Tom hopes to highlight some of the stories of some of these men. Tom, could you start by giving us a little bit of an outline about what the book is about?
Mm-hmm. The First World War, the Great War, was a huge international event. It really was a world war. There was something like 23 countries took part in it. If you simply look at some of the statistics, if you look at the statistics for soldiers, men and women killed in the British and Commonwealth forces, which numbered just about 1 million. Statistics like that are very difficult to actually take in. One of the best ways, or one of the most telling visual images that I've ever heard, was said around about 1926 when the Cenotaph in London had been open 2 or 3 years. And it was November the 11th, it was Remembrance Day. And one of the commentators said, if you took the dead of the First World War, the British and Commonwealth forces alone, if those men could march in a single column, 4 abreast, as the first 4 men were walking past the Cenotaph, the last 4 men would be leaving Durham. And that kind of visual image gives you some kind of the enormity of the conflict itself. My role in the book was to look upon one small community, and that community is New Mill, the village just outside Holmfirth. Fairly quiet spot at the moment, but in 1914 it was a pretty bustling place of mills and mines, population of about 5,000. Of that 5,000, something like 150 young men volunteered, all were conscripted into the army, and 1 chap into the navy. 34 of those young men didn't come back. And those 34 young men are commemorated in this very, very special room, the memorial room of the New Mill Club, which was opened in 1922 for purely that purpose, to commemorate those young men. So I'm the treasurer of New Mill Male Voice Choir, and we have our committee meetings in the memorial room. So for the last 3 years, I've been looking at these photographs on the wall and eventually thinking, I really ought to know more about these young men. So the book was about finding out about them, where they were born, where they lived, who their family were, when they joined up, how they joined up, where they died, how they died. But it's also a book about New Mill itself. like every town and village and city in the country, there were enormous changes in the community at home, as well as for the young men who were fighting in France and Belgium or wherever. So it's a book about New Mill, it's a book about the Great War, but principally it's a book about these 34 young men who never returned.
And how did the book come about, and what are some of the things that, I know we were talking before and you were saying there's a couple of things either side of the book that have been happening and will be happening. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The book itself is one part of a three-part project. And this is happening now. Myself and the publishers would love to trace any relatives of these 34 young men and invite them back to the club, the New Mill Club, to see the memorial room. It's a very special, very sacred room. To see the memorial room and also to share in my research, stuff that they may not know about their own families and so on there. So that's the first part of the project. The second part of the project is the launch of the book on May the 13th, and that will take place again at the club. And the third part of the project, and this is tied in with the centenary of the Great War, is that we're going to take photographs of the headstones or the memorial names of each one of these 34 young men. Apart from 32 of them are buried either in France, Belgium or Germany, and it involves visiting about 30 cemeteries, taking the photographs. The photographs, with the support of the trustees of the club and the British Legion, will be placed into a memorial book itself, which we hope will sit next to the main book in the memorial room, which is the recorded names of the 34 young men. So it's a very much a three-part project. The book, I think, is probably the main part. Obviously, it's taken nearly 18 months now to put together. But the other two aspects of the project are quite important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly for me, last year they had an exhibition in Marsden of different World War I memorabilia that different members of the village brought in, and it was extremely interesting for me learning about my granddad's father and his uncle, who my granddad hadn't really talked about too much, so finding out about their role in World War I and the different areas that they fought in. Have you had anybody come into you so far with finding out things that they hadn't known about relatives? We're
hoping that programs like this are going to spread the word, and we'll get more people getting involved on there. At the moment, the word is just spreading, so we'll see in the next few days or the next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, how do you feel that people's perception of World War I has changed, maybe in your lifetime?
The most that it's changed in my lifetime, of course, is the fact that it is now out of living memory, almost entirely. I don't think there's one soldier left alive now who came back. It's so, all that we've got now that's extra from what we've already tabulated is from people who didn't go to war, but whose fathers and grandfathers did, and snippets and bits of memory from that. We've lost it now. We cannot get any first-hand account of it, and we never will now. It's a great reason for regret for me, because of course it wasn't my father's grandfather, it was my actual grandfather that was in the war, and he was one of the ones that I think would have talked about it. The problem, I didn't want to hear a 5-6-year-old boy, well, how I wish I would have just listened to him more than I did. All I know is that he was in a cavalry regiment, and he survived when many of his fellow horsemen and incidentally soldiers, because he was a captain, didn't survive. He must have been through hell, and I just didn't listen. And it's gone. I can't bring it back. I will never ever know. So the more people get in touch, the more snippets that my grandfather said this that we get now, the better it's going to be for people on the 200-year anniversary, on the 300-year anniversary. Yes, because that's the only thing we've got to go on now, people's reminiscence of people reminiscing.
Based on that then, Tom, how important do you feel it is to maintain a connection with our history?
If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. You're doomed to repeat the failures. Hopefully you remember the successes as well. So yes, history is vitally important, but it's much more than that. The Great War itself, because of its size, because of its complexity, because of every statistic that you can throw at it, was such a unique event. One other aspect of it was that, of course, it was the first war where virtually 100% of the people involved in it were literate and wrote about it and wrote letters. That hadn't happened before. So you've got this enormous wealth of material for any historian or anyone interested in either tracing their family or whatever, enormous wealth of material that you can begin to get involved in. And it is fascinating. It's a fascinating way of working to discover something about a particular individual, what school they went to, how they grew up, who were the brothers, who were the sisters, what did the mom and dad do, and all of that. So it's, yes, so sorry.
Absolutely, no, that's great. Thank you very much to both of you for your input. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for on that topic. As always, you can get in contact with the Weekly Wind-Up via email, info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, or you can find us on Twitter, search at the Weekly Wind-Up. If you're watching this programme and you may think that one of your relatives is one of the people that Tom's book is about, please do get in contact with us and we can feed you on to Tom. Good luck with your book, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks to my guests for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I've been Kyle Warwick. Thank you and goodbye.